All right, all you positive heads. On this week's SoulShare episode, I'm very excited to have Anil Seth here with me on the show. Anil is a neuroscientist, author, public speaker who has pioneered research into the brain basis of consciousness for more than 25 years. Hello, Anil. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hi, Brandon. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, very excited to dive in. Yeah, you made it easy at the beginning to. Normally, I try and pick a few things to touch on that the person has done, and you had so many like cool things that you've accomplished. I'm like, you know what? Let's just save it because I'll be reading for a long time. I always just write my little intro. That's the only thing I write. But before we jump into a little bit of your backstory and kind of getting some basis here, I would like to start with my cliche opening question, which is this. You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
10 floors to answer. My answer would be, my passion is to understand who we are, why we are the way we are. It's to understand the nature of experience and how it fits into this picture of the universe around us that we are part of.
Yeah. That is a lifelong quest you're on, I'm sure, to be sure. And speaking of that, yeah, please share with us whatever feels relevant to share regarding your backstory to give us some, kind of context here.
I mean, consciousness is this word. I think you probably encounter many different meanings of it, and it's something that whatever meaning that you tend to prefer, it's one of these topics that really grabs one's attention almost existentially.
Yeah.
And for me, growing up, I was always, like many kids, I think, I was always interested in these fairly deep questions about who am I? Why am I me and not someone else?
Yeah.
Where was I before I was born? Do I have free will? And these questions later have matured into more specific questions, like how is it that this mess of electrified pate inside my skull gives rise to any kind of experience, the redness of red or the feeling of joy or of envy? Why am I not just a complicated biological object roaming around in subjective darkness?
Right.
So these are questions that stay with us, because for each of us, consciousness, the ability to have experiences of the self and of the world, consciousness is really the only thing that matters. Without consciousness, there's no pain, no pleasure, no fear, no joy, no hope, no despair.
Right.
And we all encounter birth and death in our lives, so we all wonder about these things. And most people, I think, very sensibly move out of that this kind of philosophical, metaphysical black hole and go on to do other very useful things. But somehow I kept getting drawn back, because it also seemed to me to be one of these big questions in science and philosophy that hadn't really been answered yet. It's still not answered, and spoiler alert, such as it's necessary, I don't think it's going to get answered in full anytime soon.
Yeah.
But I kept getting drawn back to it, and I got lucky that the study of consciousness had begun to be part of normal science again. And so my background was really, I started off studying physics, and then I moved to do a PhD in computer science and artificial intelligence. In the days when you couldn't get a lot of money with that degree, it was it was not now.
Your timing
timing was terrible. And only after that did I wind up in California. Actually, I ended up in San Diego for a few years, working at a neuroscience research institute, where I was first able to focus on understanding the brain basis of consciousness. After spending a few years there, I moved back to the UK, to the University of Sussex, which is near London, in Brighton, just on the south coast. And I've been here now for over 15 years, running a research group where we try and bring together many different disciplines, from philosophy to psychology to neuroscience to AI again, to try and understand how consciousness happens, how perception works, but also to try and realize some of its implications for society, in medicine, in technology, and even in strange areas like politics. I think there's an ethics. It's a science that's really meaningful to each of us individually, but also to society as a whole.
Yeah, it's the study of consciousness, like you said, it is it's a fascinating thing to explore, and it feels like we're just tapping into even getting to sort of the fundamental levels. I mean, even as of today, I mean, an hour before this, I saw, I, you know, Elon Musk's Neuralink, first patient is recovering well and moving things with his mind, the mouse with his mind. Like that was an hour ago, that we've seen this thing with monkeys and whatnot. And now here we are. So, yeah, I mean, and then of course you have the explosion of AI in the last year, or in the last, once again, as of this recording, it's within a week that I forget what the new Chat GBT, I forget what it's called, Nora or
You mean
something.
Sora,
Sora.
the algorithm that's generating these freakily good videos from text
From
prompts?
text, like
Yeah.
text prompts, and here,
Mhm.
make a movie of the gold rush and whatever, and all of a sudden there it is. It's like, what is happening? For me, looking at the world through a very I guess spiritual centric lens, I think in terms of like, okay, on the other side, of course, believing in life beyond the physical, you can conceptualize that you would imagine things and they instantly sort of appear, and we've all kind of played with these ideas at the very least, if not subscribe to them. But it seems like there's sort of a thinning of the veil is the way I view it. Like we're getting closer to what it may be like in other dimensions of reality, where it's like, okay, you think it and it appears, sort of thing. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this idea that these, that the physical and non-physical dimensions perhaps are merging, and that's what we're seeing with a lot of these developments.
Well, that's I think there's I rather think they're a bit separate, and certainly that's
Mm-hmm.
how I treat them. All these questions. I think there are two issues that you raised. One is, what is the relation between the physical, the material, the neurons and I don't know, cells that make up my body and my brain, the blood, the guts, and the mental and thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, the sense of self, the sense of free will. I mean, these seem to be things that are non-physical.
Mm-hmm.
And we're of course used to some things are non-physical. Information is non-physical, right? It can be associated with a physical system, but information itself is defined, not in terms of any particular physical thing.
Right.
So there's that. And then there's what this current wave of technology is doing to our conceptions about that and our conscious experiences in general. So on the first point, I mean, I tend to be, well, I am what I describe as a pragmatic materialist, which means I think conscious experiences and other mental states, the stuff of mind, I think that is a property of matter organized in some way.
Mm.
That there's no separate realm of the mental and then completely separate realm of the physical. The philosopher Rene Descartes in the 17th century talked about this in terms of dualism, that you had the realm of the physical, the realm of the mental, and then you have this immense problem of how you get the two to interact, because it seems clearly they do. We open our eyes, we see things that are there. We can drive our bodies to do things by intending to act, and then we act. So I'm of the view that certainly our best way to understand the nature of consciousness and self
Mm-hmm.
is to think of consciousness as a
Mm.
property of the physical, even if we don't know exactly
Hmm.
how that is. And this may be wrong, I may be entirely wrong about this in the end, but we're not at the end yet. I think we're only part way along this journey. And one of the things that's happening in this journey is the advent of all these new technologies. I mean, AI has been around for a long time, but it's certainly accelerated, at least in some dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, same with Neuralink and brain stimulation. This the enormous amount of media attention paid to Elon Musk's announcement a couple of weeks ago now, sometimes pretended that this was the first time a human patient had received a brain implant, but that's not true at all. I mean, this has been going on
Right.
for decades.
Right. Right.
But
Right.
these new technologies certainly change the space of experiences that we humans can have, because you change the brain. you change conscious experience, or you change the things that brains interact with, and you change the nature of our experience as well. So for me, it's a fascinating question about how will these new technologies lead us to maybe develop new beliefs about the nature of consciousness. For instance, will people start thinking that AI systems like ChatGPT actually are conscious as well as potentially being intelligent? That's a massive change, or certainly it's a very significant aspect of how people see consciousness out there in the world.
Yeah.
Because it's very tempting to do so because they speak so fluently until you catch them out, and then you realize, no, it's just a dumb algorithm predicting the next bit of a word. But these
Right.
things get better all the time.
Right. So, am I hearing you correctly that then you think all consciousness is created within the brain and there isn't an external, um, sort of like I think of a past guest, Nassim Haramein, said something to the effect of looking for consciousness in the brain is like looking inside a radio for the announcer. You know, am I hearing you correctly that you feel that consciousness is all originated within the brain and there isn't an external signal of sorts coming in?
That's my working assumption. Now, I
Okay.
don't actually know if that's true. It's not that I firmly believe this to be the case,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't think anyone
Mm-hmm.
really knows enough to be fully confident in any of these views. I mean,
Right.
there are alternative views that consciousness is fundamental. It's everywhere. It's part of the universe in the same way energy or mass is. That's a panpsychism
Mm-hmm.
view. And there's other views that we're just mistaken about there being any special thing about consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
We're just machines that unfold in particular ways. So I think I'm not, and I don't like either of these two perspectives. I think consciousness is real. We have conscious experiences,
Mm-hmm.
but yes, as a working assumption,
Mm.
we know that consciousness is intimately tied
Yeah.
to the brain. I mean, general anesthesia is a perfect example of that. You have general anesthesia
Mm-hmm.
and consciousness, at least the kind of human-centered consciousness
Mm-hmm.
that's our starting point. That goes away entirely. And you
Mm-hmm.
change the brain, you change consciousness. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, I think minimally they're very, very intimately related.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me is enough to let's see how far we can go with that. But of course, it does have implications. It does mean that, for instance, when your brain stops
Yeah.
at the end of life,
Yeah.
well, then so does consciousness under this view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, of course, I look at a lot of things like near death experiences that have happened that are, and you have these common threads a lot of times, or, uh, you know, let's call it psychic phenomenon, where, even personal things of communications that led to something very meaningful. My dead grandfather appearing and giving me a message that is like ridiculously meaningful the next day and leads to big events in people's lives and huge ripples of impact. And like, well, that signal came from somewhere in my opinion, right? Or the person who's hit over the head with a hammer and all of a sudden speaks fluent French. Like, you don't get hit hard enough, in my opinion, that your brain rewires itself and learns this external language that was created out there, right? Unless it's part of a collective consciousness, which there's so much evidence to show. I mean, the meditators in DC in early 90s who completely, the chief of police said, okay, these guys are going to do this group meditation to lower crime, and they say it's going to be 25% or 30% reduction. He's like, it's going to have to snow in July for that to happen. And lo and behold, it happened without the snow. So, to me, having my own exploration of this stuff and personal experiences led to there being zero doubt that there's this it's beyond the physical. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious, how you sort of have you looked at that sort of. I got to imagine you have looked at some of these things, and I'm just curious how you came to the conclusion that
Yeah,
those
I
things
mean,
are not
zero doubt is a state of mind which I've never reached in
yeah,
anything.
right,
So I'm
right.
kind
Okay, yeah,
of envy that a
99%.
little bit.
I hear you. I hear you. Only,
Um,
as in Star Wars says, only Siths speak in absolutes, so
that's right.
I don't
But,
consider
but but I think it's
myself a
important,
Sith
right?
Lord.
I think it's important because I think it's quite symmetrical, even if it's opposite to how I feel. Like I'm fairly sure that consciousness is a property of the brain, but I'm not 100% sure. And in some of the examples you describe,
Hmm.
um, there's they're very hard to experimentally tie down for all sorts of maybe fairly obvious reasons that it's very hard to do well-controlled, repeatable experiments.
Hmm.
So they can be very, very compelling, but often as one-offs. And doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means it's really hard
Happens a lot,
to get the kind of yeah. But I mean,
tremendous amount.
so a good example. I think that we can look at in two ways is something like an out-of-body experience.
Hmm.
So not let's say not a near-death experience, but although sometimes the two happen together, but an out-of-body experience where people experience seeing themselves from a perspective that's outside their physical body,
Hmm.
maybe from above, and perhaps end up flying around somewhere and traveling.
Hmm.
And these experiences, they're real, right? People have these experiences, and I absolutely don't deny that. Moreover, these experiences can be extremely meaningful. You talked about the message from your grandfather or great grandfather being extremely. I mean,
It like
these
led to real world
right?
happenings that would not have happened had the very detailed. I mean, I could share the story and just if it would be interesting to do, just to see what your thoughts are on
Yeah,
it.
but by all means. But let me just. We will do that. I'd love to hear. But I can totally accept that these experiences are all very, very meaningful. And I've had experiences too
Mhm.
that are meaningful. But that doesn't mean that one has to take them literally. I think one can take them seriously, but not literally. So for an out of body experience,
Mhm.
it turns out that it's also possible to artificially induce an out of body experience by stimulating the brain in a particular
Mhm.
way. This has been done since Wilder Penfield in the mid 20th century.
Mhm.
Um, and when experiments have been done that try to see whether indeed like somebody who perceives themselves as floating above the body can actually see things that would be only visible from that higher perspective, turns
Mhm.
out they can't. They can't. I mean, so there's not much evidence for consciousness actually leaving the body, but there's very good evidence that the brain's idea about where the first person perspective is, that's something that can change. So you can accommodate the same experience in two ways. One which requires a lot of you have to depart quite significantly from the rest of science, a
Mhm.
general scientific picture, and the other in which is relatively continuous, and I would think actually more illuminating, because it means that something that we take as intrinsic to the self, which is we see things from a particular point of view,
Yeah.
well, that's actually something that's always being constructed, always being generated. And when I think about traditions such as the Buddhist perspective, that makes an awful lot of sense,
Mhm.
that what we take as sort of real and permanent and fixed is not. It's always in flux. It's always changing. So in this sense, the more scientific explanation of out of body experience is well aligned with a lot of spiritual views about impermanence and the nature of self, the constructed nature of self, and so on. But sorry, I would
No,
do want to hear
no,
your
no, no,
account
no,
because
absolutely. And I really want to hear your. I mean, this is great. I want to hear your perspective as well. And one thing that came up, you were just saying how out of body experiences, there's no evidence, or it's hard to create evidence around that. And I've heard accounts of people who were completely out, completely flatlined, yet they know what was being discussed in the lobby. They knew what was, they can like literally, recount you were talking to so and so about this sitting next to the snack machine while I was like pretty much dead in there. So I don't know if you've ever come across any of these accounts. And of course, is that scientific proof? No.
I mean, this is
I
the
think that's
problem.
maybe
Yeah.
what you're getting at. So
I mean, this is the problem. I think this is where, yeah, it gets difficult. And, I think, I do try to be open-minded about these things because these things are testable. These things could be the case. And there are, as you say, there are lots of reports of instances like this. But there's a cliche which I think applies in this case, which is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
sure.
For these things to actually happen, a lot of what we know about how the universe and the world and the mind and the brain and physics, that has to be wrong. There's no way to account for these things with the way in which we look at the universe.
It's always shifting, though, right?
It is. It always shifting. Yeah. No, that's true.
Now, and
it's true.
Now it'll be the same.
Of course, it does shift. It's a question of by how much, and how much do you have to throw away? Something like relativity didn't disprove Newton. It accommodated Newton into something larger, and so the same might be the case here. But anyway, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Einstein's theory needed this really, really sophisticated experiment to be done multiple times before people bought into his crazy ideas about space and time being related. And so this is why I just have to be a little skeptical of even many reports, because what you really need to establish phenomena like this is not just many independent reports. Like, that's just the sort of sum of anecdotes, which is not a statistically well-controlled experiment. And in the examples that I know, and I may not know them all, when people have tried to do these things in a statistically controlled way, either you just can't do it because of the nature of the situation. It's just a one-off. It just happens. Or it doesn't really stand up. But again, I want to underline that this does not remove the meaning of the experiences for the people that have them.
Sure.
The same could be said of, like, when I look out into the world and I see, if I look out of my window now, I want to pretend it's a bright blue sky. It's a gray sky, but because I'm in England, but it's a sky. And the colors that I experience bring meaning and joy to my world, to my life. But colors don't actually exist, right? Colors out there in the world don't exist. There's just electromagnetic radiation at different wavelengths, and our eyes are sensitive to 3 of them, and out of different combinations of 3 wavelengths, which are just, they don't have colors. They're just different wavelengths. The brain creates this whole beautiful palette of colors, in collaboration, if you like, with the world. So does this mean my experience of color is now pointless and drained of meaning? No, not at all. It's even though color doesn't objectively exist, these experiences are still incredibly important and meaningful. And often I think there's a temptation to think that if a phenomenon isn't, how it actually appears, like, if an out-of-body experience isn't really my soul flying around, then it's meaningless, and that's really not the case.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. There's a book that comes to mind. Written 20 some years ago, a professor at UCI, which is close to where I'm at now, called The Afterlife Experiments, where he attempted to really, let's put this to scientific study, double blind, and they came to pretty, conclusive from his, you'd have to look at the book. It's been 20 years since I've seen it, but I don't know if you're familiar with that book or not.
I'm not. But there's a lot of, again, as you said, things change. One thing that's changed is what we count as good evidence for things now. So certainly standards of how experiments are done have changed as well. One of my friends in the UK is a woman called Susan Blackmore, who started out her career very convinced that so-called parapsychological effects like telepathy and things like this, mind, were real, existed, and scientists just hadn't bothered to look hard enough, or had a lot of biases against and prejudices against these phenomena. So she really tried to look for evidence with the pride that they did exist, but after quite some time and just a number of experiments that turned up precisely the opposite result, went the other way and ended up
Interesting, because
deciding that
I've heard
these
so many
phenomena
stories.
don't exist. And it's quite nice to see somebody change their mind, because I'm aware that's doesn't often happen in any
I've heard a
field.
bunch of stories of the other way. They
Right.
came in very skeptical, because I've been doing this show 10 years and I've, heard and by the way, I really appreciate having someone on who has a little bit, most people who are on the show are pretty in line with the way I think, and that's great and all, but it's somewhat more interesting to have a little bit of a different point of view. So, please don't mistake my anything for other than,
No, and it's interesting to to find the points where we might also agree, even if we agree for
sure.
different background reasons.
Okay, so I'm going to share my story with you, and I
Yeah.
want your analysis of it. And by the way, I mean, we could take hours of me sharing stories that are similar, and they're like kind of like wooish, like wow, that's really, somewhat trippy and intense. But so of course, believing very wholeheartedly that in life beyond life for me, physical life, I this was a really cool experience, and I feel like it was a spirit communication. So I'm sleeping at night, and all of a sudden my grandmother and grandfather are on the line. It's like a phone call, and I'm like, in the dream, I'm like, oh my gosh, I broke through. I've reached them, right? And this is like a couple months ago. And so it was my grandmother, who was very dear to me, like a second mother. I called Moo, and her husband Joe. And Joe was in World War II. My grandfather was in World War II, and he was at Pearl Harbor when it got bombed. And he jumped and swam. His ship is still sunk in the harbor there. That he was on. He jumped and swam and survived, luckily for me. And so it's Moo and my grandfather Joe, and Joe is like, Brandon, I need you to meet my friend Peter Finch he's a friend from World War II. And so I'm just, that's the main thing that I remember is, just connecting, the excitement of connecting. You've got to remember Peter Finch from World War II. So I wake
And you've
up.
never heard of this person before. This
Never
was a
heard of
new
him.
name for you.
Not in my conscious
Not that you
memory
know
or
of. Yeah.
awareness.
Yeah.
Now, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I thought to myself, my grandfather, I know his friend was standing next to him on the ship when the bombs came in, when the Japanese attacked, and he died and my grandfather lived. So I instantly woke up. It's like 1, 2 in the morning, and I'm thinking, I wonder if that could be his friend or something. That, I didn't know the guy's name, but I was half asleep and I was so tired. I was like, you've got to write down this name. So I write down Peter Finch, World War II on my notes on my phone and go back to sleep. Luckily, I did that because I was so half out of it at the time. I had forgotten, but when I grabbed my phone, oh, there it is. Yeah. Oh, I remember now, And so I go and I Google, is this a real person? Right. And lo and behold, Peter Finch comes up. And he was a famous actor who's the first actor to win an Oscar after he died. He won a few months later. The film had already been out or whatever. And I instantly think of my son, who I've had some very dramatic predictions in psychic stuff that have come through from him since he was young. And one was about him being being a successful actor. And, and at 18, he got some very dramatic readings, let's say, around that. And here we are 5 years later, and he's been in 50 productions in the last few years and just won Best Actor in the Los Angeles Film Awards. And so he's on the trail to, at least at the time when these predictions came in, he wasn't even acting, and so I instantly think of my son because, here's this famous actor. He's a real guy. Holy shit, Peter Finch is a real guy. That's cool. But the movie was from the early 70s, like I said, not in my conscious awareness in any way. Mm-hmm. Certainly never seen the movie called The Network that he won the Oscar for. And so then I'll keep reading his Wikipedia. Oh, the next thing behind his acting is he was known for being in a famous battle, the Battle of Darwin in World War II, as a gunner. And so not only, first, it's just something relevant in some way at all. He exists. It's somewhat relevant. And he's a gunner in World War II, Okay, wow, that's really interesting. This is a World War II guy. So I'm going later that day to go play tennis with a friend. And my son texts me as I'm walking out the door to meet my friend. Hey, Dad, can you help me do a self-tape? He needs someone to read across from him sometimes. It's a last-minute request. I've got to turn it in within an hour for a World War II film. And I'm like, now, had I not had that dream, I hadn't seen him all day or anything, so I hadn't even told him about this yet. Of course, I get full chills. Had I not had the dream and looked it up and seen this, I would not have canceled my plans. My friend was already on their way to the courts. Like, no, dude, this is too last minute. But because of that piece of information and that happening, I did. And I was like, yeah, of course, I've got to do this. I go in there, I'm reading opposite him. And as I'm reading opposite him, his character's from Kentucky or something. He's a green private. He's a gunner. And I have my character has to is like teasing him and says, hey, how about I just stand behind you and say moo? Now that's my grandfather who was so I'm literally in the audition calling him moo. And he turns it in. The very next day they get back to him. 2 days later, I've got pictures of him on set in the trenches as a gunner in this World War II pilot for a new show that he got like in 2 seconds. So, that's just one. Now I could give you probably 30 stories like that even some trippier, and so to me, I think because I am so open, my consciousness is so open to the ideas, it allows more of it in. And so, yeah, I'm just curious, would that just be like, oh, that's very just coincidental to you? Or how would you analyze that?
I think
real world impact?
Yeah, I think the real world impact's what's really important here. And, the way you tell, it's a wonderful story. I'm really glad to see
right?
you've
At the
got
very
the role.
least, it's fun. Whatever's
Yeah,
happening, it's a good time.
it's a great story. But what stands out to me is exactly the openness you had to acting on these kinds of intuitions, sort of independently of whether they're ultimately reflecting what's going on. It was your willingness to cancel that tennis appointment and do the read for your son on the basis of what might have been perceived by somebody else as a fairly flaky basis, right? And it may not have done it, but in this case you did it, and it turned out to be a very good thing that you did. So I think this is, in general, we all find there's this balance between how spontaneous, how open we are to things that we perceive as meaningful, as meaningfully connected, as happening by chance or by design, and that, I think, that will vary from person to person, but it's no bad thing to be sensitive to that.
Yeah.
Now, quite why that happened, I mean, then it's harder to say, right? Then there's no way of knowing what actually was the case.
Certainly we can't make it scientific evidence, right?
No. But in a sense, in terms of your lived experience and what you do, it doesn't really matter. Right. The experiences you have, you're building into your life in a positive way. And I might do the same thing. I haven't had a story quite like that, but I have dreams, and sometimes I dream about. Actually, I was thinking maybe this was going to be an interesting synchronicity. My grandfather also jumped off a ship in the Second World War.
Oh, wow. Really?
Not in Pearl Harbor. I'm not American, but he was being evacuated from a place called Saint Lazare. So everyone talks about Dunkirk, where the Brits were evacuated from, but a bunch of people went to the west coast of France to be evacuated from another coastal town called Saint Lazare.
Wow.
And he was on a ship called the I'm blanking on the name of the ship. It's the Lancastria, the HMS Lancastria. And he went on that ship, and it was a large cruise ship that had been repurposed to evacuate troops, and it was bombed by the Germans as it was departing, and sunk. And most people, including my grandfather, died. And this was obviously after my mother had been born, so that's why I am still around. But she was very young, and he didn't survive. And nobody knew about this. This was, at the time, it was the largest loss of life, maritime loss of life, that had been suffered.
Wow.
And Winston Churchill ordered that it be kept secret because of its potential effect on morale.
Wow.
So it was this, when it surfaced, it was kind of this quite big deal that they'd hushed this up. Even my grandmother didn't know. She wasn't told that my grandfather had died, and it was just listed as missing. Anyway, so the synchronicity stops there. I have never had a dream of my grandfather because I never met him. There's only a couple of pictures, but I do dream of my father died 10 years ago, and he regularly pops up in my dreams and probably tells me to do things. Sometimes I can well imagine that my behavior is affected by this. And then of course you might look something up in Wikipedia, and you when you want to find patterns, you will find patterns. Now if we look up in the sky on a day with little white fluffy clouds, we'll see faces in these clouds. Now we are pattern seeking creatures. Sure. And sometimes this can go too far. People with schizophrenia can end up having paranoid delusions because they connect the dots way too much, right? Yep. And have all these accompanying feelings of significance too. They'll see a stranger on a street and have this feeling of deep significance that is totally not grounded in anything. Right. And in that case, it can lead to unfortunate consequences. Right. So I think it's really, your story really evokes for me a very potent lesson in how we, what we do with the experiences that we have above and beyond where they ultimately come from.
Yeah. I'm curious. You did a big project, part of a big project called Dream Machine. I'd love to hear just the name of it alone is intriguing. So I'm curious, if you could share some details about that.
Yeah, sure. It's actually it flows on quite nicely from what we've been talking about, because it turned out to be quite a powerful way of giving people experiences that were also, for many people, quite transformative, in this specific sense of the example you described, an experience that really changed the way your life has turned out and your son's life in some way. And one of the marvelous things about working on consciousness is that we can start to see that we take things less for granted. To me, that's the real value. It's far too easy to take our conscious experience for granted. We wake up in the morning, we open our eyes, and there's the world, and here am I, grumpy in the morning, needing to take a shower and get going. Right. And we kind of overlook what a wonderful biological, physical miracle this is. It is, I think, in many senses, a miracle, like that this complicated piece of the universe can be the locus of experience. And not taking it for granted just adds richness and value to our own individual lives, and I think also to how we behave with others, how we interact with other humans and other animals too. And so the Dream Machine was a way to try and give people who are not neuroscientists or philosophers a little insight from the first person into this everyday miracle. So what the Dream Machine is, it's surprisingly simple. The name actually comes from an artist called Brian Gysin, who was in the Beat generation in the 1960s. He used to do these kinds of cut-up art, kind of collage. But another thing he did, the story goes, he was on a bus in the south of France, and the sun was setting behind a stand of trees, and that meant there was this flickering light effect coming through the bus, and he was dozing off with his eyes closed, and he suddenly started having these dramatic visual experiences of vivid colors and shapes and movement. And when the light stopped flickering, the experiences stopped. And so he built a system to try and recreate this experience. Very low tech, a bright bulb in a rotating cardboard cylinder with slits cut in it. That was the first Dream Machine. People would sit around it with their eyes closed, and they would have these powerful hallucinations. And it kind of got forgotten about for subsequent decades. And 10 years ago in my lab, we started working on something similar. I'd never heard of Gysin or the Dream Machine before, but we were looking at stroboscopic light and its effects on consciousness. And then I was contacted by a woman called Jen Crook, who told me about Gysin's Dream Machine and brought me into this project where basically, long story short, we ended up building collective dream machines that could take 30 people at a time, with multi-channel sound systems and a score composed by the musician John Hopkins, who's
Cool.
this like pioneer of electronic music.
Yeah,
And
I'm familiar.
and so groups of 30 people would go in, not really knowing what to expect. We tell them, it'll be a nice thing. You'll lie down in a sort of nice reclining seat and we'll flash lights at you. And people have these pretty incredible experiences, everyone different. But most of them have these experiences of colors they've never seen before, colors that seem to go around the back of their heads, being very immersed in these hallucinations. And you really experience them, not that you're looking at something, but you kind of experience that you are generating these experiences in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able, thanks to a very strange grant from the UK government, to build installations in 4 cities in the UK. And during 2022, during the summer of 2022, we had about 40,000 people experience this, which for an art science project was quite phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And the reports we would get afterwards were amazing. Some people found it boring, some people didn't like the flashing lights, but the vast majority of people firstly enjoyed it, but then a large number of people found it very transformative, for just recognizing what, I think, as we were saying right at the top of this conversation, for not taking our experience for granted and wondering what lies beyond or behind or underneath it.
Right. Yeah. Very, very cool. Yeah. And, it's the type of experience that probably mimics in some ways things that people experience on plant medicines or, without, all the other things that go along with it.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting. We deliberately didn't mention anything about psychedelics in any of the blurb, in any of the guidelines. Yet, of course, the first newspaper reviews immediately said, this is as close to a government-funded trip as you'll ever get.
Yeah,
And
right.
I think they are different. The experiences are different. In fact, that's one thing we're looking at, how distinct the phenomenology, the nature of the experience is, because the mechanisms are quite distinct.
Yeah.
But that's really useful from my point of view as a scientist trying to understand the nature of consciousness, because you've got different ways of eliciting unusual experiences. And the more, if you've got a black box, the more things you can do to it that change the way it works, the more chance you've got of figuring out how it works.
Yeah. One other thing that I'm curious about, if are you familiar with the Institute of Noetic Sciences? Have you ever come across?
That's in San Francisco, isn't it?
I believe so. Yeah. A guy named Dean Radin, one of the chief scientists there, or the chief scientist there, I guess, was on the show a while back. And I remember, his whole thing is sort of his aim, and certainly leaning more towards, he's very scientific, but leaning towards, his evidence has shown him that there's something beyond, it all happening in our brain. And one of the things when I was asking him about some of the results from different scientific studies that he referenced as an example or evidence was that I thought was pretty cool. And I'm wondering if you've heard of this. So they would show people different images on a screen and have nodes hooked up to their brain or whatever. And they were able to see that before they would show them a beautiful valley or pretty sky or whatever, but before they would show them something really like ugly, really violent, really moments before that, their brain would shift. And it's kind of like they knew before it was coming what was coming. And I thought that was a really interesting study, and I'm just curious if you've seen.
No, I haven't seen that. I mean, that definitely, I'd like to look at that. That's, again, it depends exactly how it's done, but that definitely falls into the category of being very hard to explain if it's a real effect.
That's what indeed would happen. Yeah. Maybe take a look at that one, Institute of Noetic Sciences and Dean Radin, and because that I liked it because of course it is so simple, and like it certainly implies that there's some intuitive faculty happening, right?
Well, yeah, I guess it would imply that somehow the content of the image is getting through to the brain before
prior to it showing on
before
screen.
it being seen,
Yep,
which would be very, very difficult for me to, or any other, I think, mainstream or even fringe neuroscientist, not mainstream neuroscientist, to explain how that's happening.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, so I'll have a look. I mean, but there, just my prior would be there's probably a more prosaic explanation, but I can't know that without reading the details.
Well, look into it and let me know if you if you find anything interesting or you're convinced. You can come back on and say, "I'm now convinced." Yeah. So many interesting directions we can take this, and I can't believe we're already 45 minutes in. Time flies. So let's talk a little bit about perceptive differences. And obviously you and I have some perceptive differences, and people in general, and how important that is to, really this idea that everyone to some degree is having a very unique experience, and yeah, sort of what your studies have shown regarding that.
Yeah, I think this is something that I'm currently really quite excited about. And it came out of this Dream Machine project as well, which was this big collaboration with artists and musicians and architects and so on. And in this Dream Machine, it was very apparent that everyone's going through the same situation, the same flashing light sequence. But of course, we all have different brains, and we all bring our different selves to each day. And so no surprise, really, that people would have different experiences, but they were really quite different. Some people would just see a few colors. Other people would have these whole narrative scenes unfolding, dreamlike sequences and so on.
Wow.
And in psychology and neuroscience, there's been some attention paid to this idea that we all differ on the inside, just as we differ on the outside. I mean, we have this whole concept of neurodiversity, which emphasizes that we all differ. But that idea of neurodiversity has tended to become associated with particular conditions like autism or ADHD, and ironically reinforces the common view that if you're not neurodivergent, then you're neurotypical, and you see things and experience things as they are, because that's what it feels like. Again, when we open our eyes, it feels like our eyes and our ears are just transparent windows onto the world as it really is. But that's not the case. Colors, again, are constructed by our brains in collaboration with the world. And we have different brains. We're going to have different color experiences. There was that remember that photo of the dress that half the world saw?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that was great, because that suddenly cut through. So people just, it wasn't that people saw different things. What really amazed me there was the conviction with which people who saw it one way had about their way, and the others, well, they're just nuts. They can't be right.
Right.
That for me is really revealing about this naive realism we have with respect to our experiences. We just take them to be real.
Yeah.
And so we've been looking into this much more. It's not the first people to do this, but we had a big study called the Perception Census, which reached again around 35,000 people across the world. They all did a bunch of simple experiments and illusions and things like that. And we have been collecting this, hopefully what will be a kind of landmark data set to try and understand how different our experiences are within this so-called normal neurotypical range, where it's too easy to assume we have the same experience because we'll use the same words and we'll behave the same way. And so this is scientifically interesting, but I think it's relevant for these bigger questions about how we live our lives, because it can cultivate a bit of humility about our own way of seeing. If we realize that something as simple as when we open our eyes and look at what's in front of us, if that's something that is not identical to how things are, but is partly how we are, the novelist Anil Seth said, we do not see things as they are. We see them as we are. And if we can really bake this in by showing it, really showing it, using data in this case as a really powerful tool to just show, no, everyone is different, really, and you're here, and you're here, and you're here. Then I think that has the potential to make us all a little bit more humble about our own ways of seeing. And of course, then, the more optimistic, idealistic view is we can cultivate a similar humility to what we believe, what we think, and begin to counteract some of these dynamics of polarization that are becoming so problematic in many areas of the world now.
100%. Yeah, it definitely fosters more empathy and understanding and open-mindedness, which I think we can use as much of that as we possibly can get on this planet right now. And what I love about it is, as I relate it to my own perspectives on the ultimate nature of reality, this idea for me, we're one with the source consciousness that creates and animates all things. I am it. It is me. The separation between you and I is actually an elaborate illusion. The consciousness that animates my form is the consciousness that animates your form, I believe. And I'm literally talking to an extension of self. And this is how source God, the universe, higher self experiences itself throughout eternity. That's, my belief regarding it. And if I had to sum it up, and
I can buy into part of that, and it may be surprised, but I think there is a sense in which what it is to be me is literally in the minds of other people.
mm-hmm.
Part of what it feels like to be me is my perception of how other people perceive me.
Right.
And that depends on what's in other people's brains.
Yeah.
So there's, we haven't met until this conversation, but, we're changing all the time.
Yep.
And now part of what it is to be me, is also part of you.
Right.
Because we've now, interacted in this
Yeah.
this brief Zoom conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think there's, these views are our views are not necessarily as opposed as one might think if you just focus on the metaphysical, like does consciousness, exist in a separate realm beyond life and death, or not. I think this is what I find remarkable is that you often get to quite a similar place.
Yeah. And what I love about this idea of different perspectives, it's like, I like the saying, there's only one truth, your truth. Like if we are fractals of the one source consciousness that creates and animates all things, and if I believe and perceive in a certain way, and I'm the creator and created rolled into one, then I am creating my reality in a way that it's a feedback loop reflecting me back to me. And so it's like I continue to get evidence to support my perspective. You continue to get evidence to support yours because we are creating it at some fundamental level. It's like Henry Ford, whether you think you can or think you can't.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's a concept, that I work with in my area called active inference, which is this idea that in my view, the brain is always making predictions about what's out there and using sensory data to update the predictions. And the predictions are what we experience. That's this creative, generative aspect of the brain.
Right.
But we don't just passively absorb data. If my brain is trying to is predicting something to be the case, it can make different actions to create that data in a self-fulfilling way. So you have this dynamic of self-reinforcement, which can affect our experiences. So we will get canalized, entrenched into different directions. I should also say that it's not like none of this, and I guess in your view too, none of this spirals off into complete relativism, right? Because some people might say, well, if my way of seeing is just my way and your way is your way, then like how do these relate to what's actually there?
Right.
Then
relative truth is how I refer to it.
You can believe in anything, right? You and that that can be just as problematic as the obverse, right? But of course, that's not true either. That in perception, even though most of us will have somewhat different experiences, there'll be a great deal of overlap. If we're standing by the side of the road and waiting to cross the road, unless we've got serious problems with our eyes or our visual brain, we'll see that truck that's approaching and we won't cross the road because evolution has made damn sure that our perceptual systems, even though they don't reveal the world as it is, they reveal the world in ways that is generally useful for our staying alive.
Might see the truck in different colors, right?
Exactly.
The grass and I'm the blue.
Yeah.
I what you just touched on, I refer to as like relative truths, like this idea, of course, as I touched on, that we're one. I can make an argument and state my belief as to why I think that is true. Yet you and I are separate. Certainly we can make that case, and both are true depending on the vantage point, I believe, from whence we're speaking, and perceiving. So I think in all truth there's some bit of untruth, and it's like these different layers of it is really interesting to consider as well.
Yes, no, that is interesting. I mean, I think for me it's the kind of incremental and self-challenging nature of science that sort of works for me as a way to ground beliefs, because you can come up with beliefs that seemingly so weird and counterintuitive. Again, in physics, things like relativity or quantum mechanics just seem totally bizarre, but nonetheless they make incredibly precise and useful predictions. And for me, that's absolutely absolutely fascinating when you have a method, a way of thinking that's sort of spread out beyond the individual and becomes this historically productive. Not always, right? I mean, science has got bad sides as well. You can get people, because it's not, I mean, there's this myth, I think, that science is purely objective. You just turn the wheel and out come facts, and it's anything but. It's subject to the same human predilections, biases, jealousies, funding. I mean, there's just human factors too, in terms of people publish papers to get jobs, and so there's and so they're motivated to maybe over-egg results in some way, and there's plenty of ways in which science falls short of this ideal as a system for generating increasingly objective truths. But nonetheless, I think it's the best system we've got. It's like was it Churchill saying about democracy? It's like the well, I always mess this quote up, but it's like the worst form of government apart from all the other ones. Something like that. It's the best of a bad job.
Right. Exactly. Well, I'd love to, as we start to wind down here, switch to a bit of story time. As we touched on, I love to hear stories of synchronicity, serendipity. You're probably not going to have a positive paranormal story, but any kind of inspiring story. I'd love to.
I think I'm going to disappoint you here by almost the opposite, but I find it inspiring in my own way, and it's certainly not a positively paranormal story, but it's actually the story that I open my book by. So I have this book called Being You, about consciousness, and the way I decided to open it was with this story about general anesthesia. And I've had 4 episodes of general anesthesia for various things now, and it's remarkable, and I found it very spiritually enriching in a strange way. Now, in general anesthesia, when it's deep enough, you're gone. It's oblivion. I didn't hear people outside the operating theater chatting. I was just gone, and I was gone in a way that's very different from sleep. When you fall asleep, even if it's a very deep sleep, when you wake up, you're kind of aware roughly of how much time has passed. It could have maybe mistaken. It might have been 6 hours instead of 8, or 8 instead of 6. But it wasn't 50 years, and it wasn't 5 minutes. But under anesthesia, it could have been either. You're just not there. You're gone, and then you're back, and no time seems to have passed. You become an object, and then you become conscious again. It's an amazing thing that we can do this. Thank God we live in.
I just had it done for the first time,
oh, really?
A
month ago.
I just had my first experience.
And I mean, it's a strange question, but did you enjoy it?
It wasn't. Maybe a little bit. I haven't even thought of it, but it was kind of like, oh wow, this is,
I mean, you don't enjoy the it because there is no it, right? But you can.
I did not enjoy it. Like it wasn't a negative experience, and
right.
All in all, I guess I think of the whole thing as positive because, there was no. It was going in for, a colonoscopy, which I've heard can be not good or whatever, but you need to do it at this, the age you're getting to, and your grandfather died of this, a different grandfather. So, and it was like, oh, that was a big nothing, So,
okay.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because the question, did you enjoy it? It's a little bit of a cheeky question because, of course, during the anesthesia, you're not having any experiences.
Right.
So, but that's kind of the point. That when I reflect on it afterwards, it's really the absence of any kind of experience that for me is this source of, that I keep coming back to. It's the kind of oblivion that I think must be similar to before we are born, and is probably similar to after we die. And it's a difficult thing to grasp, to wrap our heads around, wrap our minds around. And we can't I mean, I haven't done 10,000 hours of meditation, but I find it almost impossible to conceive of not being conscious, because to have that thought is to be conscious.
Yeah.
Yet general anesthesia doesn't care about what I think. It just like, whoop, you know, you're out and you're back. So I know it happens. You know, consciousness can go away and then come back, and this happens probably hundreds of thousands of times every day.
In a way that I can put a ball in a box and it's still there,
Yeah.
but you're not seeing it because there's something blocking it.
Yeah, maybe, you know, but certainly it's me as a subjective individual is not there during anesthesia. And this could be very scary, but I think it can also be very reassuring if you meditate on it a little bit. Think about it, just reflect about it. Because
it's way better
there's
than
nothing.
spending eternity in hell.
Well, exactly. You know, there's nothing to be afraid of. So there's a quote that I nicked, and with credit, from a book by Julian Barnes. The title of his book he's a novelist. The title of his book is Nothing to be Frightened of. And he uses that title because it has this double meaning. You know, we can be terrified of oblivion, but in the end, there's really nothing to be frightened of at all.
Right. Well, I think, and then you get really deep down to it, and I believe it's 0 and 1, right? The nothing, the everything emerges from the void. Some philosophers and you know would say, and this idea that from nothingness springs forth everything, because well, we know there's something now, and then you get into the like, okay, well, where did the something that is in this moment come from? You know, that alone shows there's not just nothing, because there's something right now from my perspective. So that instantly, that's the thing we can disprove from my perspective, that's all there is nothingness, because here we are, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think we can agree that here we are. Right here and right now.
We can agree on that for sure.
Here we are.
This has been super fascinating. I'm gonna. I do have one question for you. What?
Sure.
Your grandfather? What was his name? Can I ask what his name was?
Yeah, his name was John Frederick Delaney.
Okay.
He was from the English-Irish side of the family.
Cool. Yeah, that's my roots as well. I have a lot of Irish English roots. So I want to do something really cheeky. I'll use a word from your lands, and invite both of our grandfathers, who I think is a very interesting synchronicity that we had there. Like that, you know, here I am sharing this story to try and convince you there's more. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. My grandfather jumped from a ship, you know, in World War II. So I believe they both are very aware of this conversation. They're very tuned into it. And the moment we talk and invoke their consciousnesses that still exist is completely aware, and invite them both to come together and give you an experience that might just have you a little more questioning whether or not they're there or not, something that's beyond like you just can't come to this is a coincidence or not meaningful type of experience. So I just want to set that intention. And should you have something really epic happen, please report back to me. And I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, I am attempting to communicate in this moment with them both, as I believe they exist, to give you the experience, something that really rocks your world.
All right, thank you. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. I look forward to hearing about it from you. So I do have one final question, and it is this. Well, before I move on to my final question, please tell people the best way to connect with you, follow your work, etc.
Oh, thank you. So the best way to find out a bit more about, you know, things we've been talking about, and they really are pretty close to these themes, is my recent book called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, which came out in late 2021. It's intended for general audience, like a non-scientific audience, but people who are interested in consciousness, check out the book. And otherwise, I've got a website, anilseth.com, which keeps up to date with where I'm going to be and what I write about and things like that. And I'm on X or Twitter at Anil K. Seth.
Excellent. Well, my final question, my cliche closer for you is this. in 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to Anil Seth?
The meaning of life for each of us is to persist, to continue being alive in a way that mitigates suffering for those around us, including ourselves and those who will come after us.
Excellent. Neil, thank you so much. I very much enjoyed having this conversation with you, and appreciate everything that all the wonderful work you're doing in the world. And yeah, I appreciate all of you for tuning in your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts out there to another episode. Till next time, journey well.